Henry Louis Gates' TV show, Finding Your Roots, is one of my guilty pleasures, which I feel like anytime I announce that it's a guilty pleasure, it's like revealing a lot about how spicy my life is not. But I'm like, how do you like to unwind after a long week? I like to fire up the PBS app on our Roku, watch a show about celebrities doing their family trees. But every once in a while, my mild habit does get a little spicy. And celebrities find interesting and fascinating pieces of history in their family trees, which is what happened on the episode with Tamara Mowry Housley. And her 13th great-grandfather was not just anybody on the Mayflower. He was William Brewster, the ruling elder of the people on the Mayflower, which means he was essentially, right, he was their minister. He was and that if you, maybe some of you can call to mind, there's sort of a famous painted depiction of the first Thanksgiving, where there's one guy doing this over everyone else. That's William Brewster. Tamara from Sister Sister's 13th great-grandfather. And that what it inspires in her is not just a reflection about that particular point of American history, but for her, the specificity of what it means to be biracial in the United States. And that this is what she says, right, when Henry Louis Gates, who always sort of, when he's interviewing celebrities about difficult pieces of their, or complicated pieces of their family trees, he always just sort of looks at them really mildly, like he's asking them what kind of soda they'd like, and says, so you've found out that your 13th great-grandfather was one of the original colonizers. How does that make you feel? And she responds, this is what's crazy about being biracial. I have blood that started it and blood that was enslaved by it. That her life, her ancestry, her existence in the day-to-day world is wrapped up in multiple, sometimes competing histories of who she has been and who she would like to be. She is the descendant of the ruling elder of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. And if you watch the episode, not too many spoiler alerts, I hope. She's also the descendant of enslaved people who were part of a slave revolt in the Bahamas. All of those histories and stories live in her. All of those are her people. And the Passover story, the sort of main character, if there is ever a main character in any Bible story, the main character of the Passover story, or at least the protagonist, is Moses. You know he's the protagonist because he's the one who Charlton Heston plays in the Ten Commandments. And Moses is somebody who also spends a lot of his life trying to figure out who he is, and more particularly, whose he is, to whom he belongs. Who are his people? And once he figures out who his people are, what does that require of him? What does it require of him to live into the deep truth that he is not, as he thought as he was growing up, he is not necessarily Egyptian, he is not part of Pharaoh's family, though when he was sent as a baby in the little basket of reeds on the river, was found by a member of Pharaoh's household and raised as such, that he is in fact one of the Hebrews, that his people are the ones who are enslaved. His people are the one who are suffering. These stories that we inherit, whether we inherit them about our own particular biological families or about the communities we are a part of, these stories, whether we are an actress or Moses or somewhere in between, like the rest of us. These stories live in us. They shape us. One of my favorite vignettes from the book of Exodus, right, from the sort of the Exodus story that forms the Passover story, is that early in the book of Exodus, in the second chapter, Moses is walking around, right? He is sort of grown up. He's an adult now, or at least an older teenager. And he sees an Egyptian beating an older Hebrew man. And that he, in that moment, with the conflict of all of the people he has been, all of the people he could be, all of the people who claim him and who he is moved to retributive violence, right? He actually then strikes and kills the Egyptian who's beating the Hebrew man. And it is this vignette that sort of marks the beginning of Moses' journey away from the life he was raised in and into his life as a prophet. It's what eventually sparks him to leave, to go into the desert, to meet the Zipporah, who he marries, to encounter the burning bush, all that good, typical Moses stuff. Starts with this moment that is just like all of these threads of who he has been and who he is yet to be coming together in this one moment. I think of it sometimes as his heart softening. And that the people he has been raised to see as enslavable are in fact worthy and deserving of respect. And then as the book of Exodus continues and as the Passover story continues, what we encounter in Pharaoh over and over again, right? There's the famous, we all know the refrain, right? Moses, right, God tells Moses he is here to set the people free, and so he goes to Pharaoh, and what does he say to Pharaoh? Let my people go. And then Pharaoh doesn't let the people go, and then there's a plague of some kind, frogs, etc. And then, right, in the story, Pharaoh sort of gets annoyed enough by all the frogs or all the blood in the river or all the locusts and says, fine, take your people and go. And then the plague relents, and then Pharaoh reconsiders. And the way it gets translated into English, the way the Hebrew is translated into English in those portions, is that Pharaoh's heart hardens. That his heart hardens again, that his heart was briefly softened by how unbearable the plague was. And then as soon as the plague relents, his heart hardens again. And that's the word that's used over and over again to describe what is happening in Pharaoh's decision process. And so what is getting in the way of freedom, of liberation for the Hebrew people is not just that the Egyptians are mean. It's that hard-heartedness. And that's what I so appreciate about that video and the way it frames the Seder, is that the Seder is not just a retelling of the Exodus story. It's an invitation to experience the story and your place in it, and what it means today. And I think one of the core questions in it is, how is it possible for one human being to believe that another should be enslaved? What is the human condition that makes it possible to enslave another human being? And that one of the, right, in the story, it is hard-heartedness. And as I have thought about that hard-heartedness in the story and that hardening of the heart as something that prevents people from their rightful walk to freedom, I have thought about its companion, which is, of course, soft-heartedness. And sometimes we think about soft-heartedness as people who are too vulnerable. How often do we say, right, that person wears their heart on their sleeve? And it's not always a compliment. What would it look like if we sought to cultivate soft-heartedness in a world that is, right, there are so many invitations to harden our heart out there, to calcify, right, to pick a position and keep it that way. But the truth is that soft-heartedness is actually one of our great advantages as human beings. Our ability to be soft is one of our greatest gifts. I recently read a book about human evolution that my wife is tired of hearing about. But it has led me to think a lot about how it is that we evolved to this point and this place. What are the things that have allowed us to make it this far, to go from caves to, I don't know, inventing Facebook in actually a very short time span from an evolutionary perspective? And one of the things that has allowed us to do that is how deeply dependent we are when we are first born. That many animals, how many of you, right, like a horse is born and then it's walking, 2 minutes later. That is not how human beings are born into this world. We are completely dependent. And in fact, we have to be soft, right? That's one of the, evolution made our skulls soft, because otherwise there was no way we could escape the weird upright pelvis that was developing. That we arrive soft, unformed, underformed, completely, we can't even cling on like most other primates. But that our ability to arrive in the world radically dependent, and our ability to form communities that make it possible to raise offspring who arrive radically dependent on their parents, that's actually our great evolutionary advantage. That is something that has given us a leg up over and over and over again. And we may disagree about what we have done with all of our evolutionary know-how. Was inventing Facebook really what we were evolved to do? Was this really the direction we were hoping we would go? But that softness, vulnerability, and our dependence on one another, that is part of what makes us human. That is part of what gives us the ability to do incredible things. So I wonder, how can we reconnect with this softness, this vulnerability? We've been talking all April about interdependence, about our need to rely on one another, and that the universalist half of our family tree, as Unitarian Universalists, right, the universalist half of our family tree, the way it shows up now in our lives and in our spiritual journeys and in our communities, is that we have a commitment that none of us is free until all of us are free. Or that liberation or freedom or possibility is not reserved for some subset of humanity. It's not reserved for one type of person. It's not reserved for one religion. It's not reserved for one ethnic group. It's not reserved for the people who have read a certain book. It's not reserved for the people who vote a certain way. It is not reserved for any one subset of people. It's for all of us. Hebrews, Egyptians, people of all races, people of all genders. It's in that Circle Round for Freedom written by Jewish feminist songwriter Linda Hirschhorn, right? It does not say, for all of you imprisoned, circle for release. It's for all of us. Meaning that if one among us is not free, if one among the human family is not able to flourish, then none of us is really truly flourishing. And that our willingness to accept that that's just some sort of natural condition of human beings is a hardening of our hearts. I love the reframe that I'll share in a moment from the Puerto Rican and Jewish poet Aurora Levins Morales. This is an excerpt from her poem Red Sea, April 2002. And it's a reimagining, right, from the famous scene of the Exodus story where Pharaoh's heart has hardened again and the Egyptian army has been sent to recapture the Hebrews. And Moses parts the Red Sea, the Hebrews cross, and then the sea swallows the Egyptians. This is from Red Sea, April 2002. But the turbulent water will not part for us. We've lost the trick of it. Back then, one man's faith opened the way. He stepped in, we were released, our enemies drowned. This time, we are tied together at the ankles. We cannot cross until we carry each other. All of us refugees, all of us prophets. No more taking turns on history's wheel, trying to collect old debts no one can pay. The sea will not open that way. This time, that country is what we promise each other. Our rage pressed cheek to cheek until tears flood the space between, until there are no enemies left. Because this time, no one will be left to drown, and all of us must be chosen. This time, it's all of us or none. And that is the tricky, marvelous, terrifying, heart-softening truth about saying that we are part of some interdependent human family. It means that we're tied at the ankles to our enemies. It means that we cannot cross until we carry each other. Can you imagine if our hearts softened enough until there were no enemies left? What might be possible? How might our world be different? We cannot cross until we carry each other. May it be so. Amen.